Good morning. It's 10:53, Monday, November 24th. This is episode 9 of the WTK report. I'm going to talk today about the capital cycle, Goldman being bullish on China, Alibaba. Um, Housekeeping item, I want to follow up on the bad luck of Florida State. I'm going to read the David Hale piece at the end. So if you're not into college football like I am, or sports in general like I am, you can wait for that. Uh, Teasers and tags. I got more free cash flow coming. I'm working on the E&P update still. I know there's a lot of nervousness around natural gas. We'll talk about that with the capital cycle as I pontificate on the capital cycle today. I've got a free cash flow article coming that kind of summarizes all these numbers I've been rolling out on the free cash flow yields. That'll help. It'll be similar to the article I wrote in May on the discount to tangible book value. If you look back at that, that was a really opportune time. Obviously, a good time in the markets to invest in May. It's a little different today. I am feeling pretty good. There's a lot of nervousness with natural gas, and I will be addressing that a little bit. But when I think about natural gas, I think, of the capital cycle. I just made a comment in live chat here on the contrarian because Gabriel's kind of nervous, and he and I are going to have a discussion here pretty soon. But he's worried about production growth, and I can see that. However, when you look at the bigger picture for natural gas, we talk about there's been a bubble in capital spending in energy investments in shale from 2010 to 2020. But what that meant in practicality was circa 2010 Appalachia, which today produces about 35 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas, didn't hardly produce anything. So it's the biggest basin of production in the U.S. At the start of the shale revolution, there wasn't any production there. The Permian, which is about 20 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas, was a lot less back then. So, I mean, together they're over 50% of dry natural gas supply that wasn't around. And, we had the shale revolution, and then what that meant was this new supply came online, and it's kept prices lower for a long time here because the energy equivalent of natural gas is like 6 to 1 to oil. So it should trade at, historically before the shale revolution, it traded at 10 to 1 to 6 to 1 price band. So, at $60 oil, for example, that'd be $6 to $10 of natural gas prices. We've been below that for a long time, but that was because there was a flood of capital that came in looking for returns. And Antero was a perfect example. They had their IPO, was probably the highest price that they've been, around that IPO window. They hedged. They were very successful in hedging, made over $5 billion as they grew their production profile. They spent $2 to $3 billion a year, sometimes more in capex, and that was from, really the 2010 to 2020 era. And after that, they've kind of throttled back to a maintenance capex, which got down to as low as around the $500 million range. So I bring that up because it's very pertinent today with AI and the amount of capex that's being invested in pursuit of artificial intelligence, robotics, etc. It dwarfs anything that we've seen in modern market history, the amount of capital being invested. And ultimately, what that will do is it's going to lower returns. We're seeing that already, potentially with the Google Gemini 3.0 release. There's, people are hailing it. And importantly, it doesn't use NVIDIA's chips. They have their own chips that are produced by Broadcom, AVGO. And what, again, bigger picture, just like the shale industry, a ton of money is being thrown at this. They're essentially competition, and it's new compute. It's going to lower prices as the computing part becomes, more commodity oriented. So, I was talking with Sanjay about this morning. On, one side of the coin, you could say that the Gemini has proved that more compute is still working, so the scaling law is still working, which would be good for NVIDIA. But on the other side, I ultimately think that compute becomes a commodity and will probably overbuild, and so you have to think of the ramifications for that. I don't think it's going to affect the real market in the real economy in 2026. And to use a parallel, you have to remember 2000 to 2002, the NASDAQ the S&P was down 42%. The Nasdaq was down a lot more. Stocks like Amazon were down 94% from peak to bottom. But the real economy barely had a technical recession, and you can make an argument that it only had a technical recession because of the aftermath of 9/11. But it was just a technicality, and with the actual physical build out in the real economy, you could eventually see a downturn, especially in large cap tech leaders, but the technology space, and it may not have as big of an impact on the real economy as everybody's worried about. I know the wealth effect is big, passive is a lot bigger today than it was back then, but that's an interesting parallel. But you want to think of it in terms of the capital cycle. Homework for Thanksgiving. If you guys haven't read it yet, Edward Chancellor, he's one of my favorite writers. A foundational piece for the contrarian would be to, or for anybody who's listening to me, one of the foundational books would be to read The Capital Cycle by Edward Chancellor. Um, it's terrific. I wrote a couple posts on it back in 2016 that I'll reference when I reference Edward Chancellor's work. And it really does give you a foundation for thinking about, how the flood of capital impacts returns, future returns going forward. So that's your homework assignment, book to read. Um, Stock on my mind today, Novo Nordisk, NVO. They were down 10% at the open as their semaglutide wasn't proven to work for Alzheimer's. Kai, texted him this morning. He's buying. It was good because it's only down about 6% now. I want to dig into their free cash flow profile, but Novo Nordisk is pretty cheap here relative to something like Eli Lilly. It's come down a lot. It had climbed back from the lows today, so that's yesterday. Cogent was the stock on my mind today. Novo Nordisk is the one at the top of my mind. Um, the Goldman has been pretty bullish in China. I noticed that BABA is up. Was up pre-market, is up at the open today. When I was going through the free cash flow estimates, BABA's free cash flow yield is not as good as it has been. The last 4 or 5 years, it's averaged about 7%. It's down to about 3.8% because they've ramped up their capital spending on AI. Another competitor, China's open AI models are all competitors, and it's more capital even beyond the U.S. that's being flooded in the market. But BABA's ramped up their spending, and the stock price has appreciated from the lows. I've kept buying BABA in the FAMDCA portfolio. I'm kind of on the fence here. I still think it's really cheap, because the amount of cash on their balance sheet. It's cheap from a traditional valuation metric ratio, but we're up a lot from our cost basis in that FAMDCA portfolio. So, I'm going to make a decision here at the end of the month. I've got 3 batches to buy to catch up. I'm torn on BABA because it's still pretty cheap. It doesn't have the free cash flow yield, though, that some of the other alternatives that we're looking at do have. Now, the alternative is BABA could really have a runway for growth here because they're out of favor for various reasons. But it's one of those potential high quality businesses that that you may not get the 15 or 20%, or 10% plus free cash flow yield that we're looking for in other places. With that, that's pretty much my market commentary. I wanted to read the David Hale bad luck piece on Florida State. He's one of my favorite authors on ESPN. He had, I love reading his week college football recap that comes out like usually early Sunday morning. But he, we have some Florida State fans. We have, fans like John Doerr was a fan of Texas. I know Anu's a fan of Oklahoma. I root for, Notre Dame, Indiana, the Indiana teams all across the country. We've got Clemson fans, we've got California guys, we've got Oregon, and Washington fans. So follow college football a lot, college basketball. I like the NFL. The Colts had a tough loss yesterday. The Bears won, which I grew up in Chicago. Colts lost to Kansas City. But David Hale writes this piece, and I love his writing. So I'm just going to read it kind of verbatim here. It says, trending up, suffering for the Seminoles. And again, Brooksky and Plummer are Seminole fans there. I guess Norvell's going to stay, they said. I think it's a good move. But Speaking of the coaching carousel, the Lane Kiffin thing is fascinating to me. That he's going to announce his decision whether to stay at Ole Miss or go to LSU or Florida after the Egg Bowls on Friday. Um, you know, there's going to be a lot of drama. Mississippi State's pretty good. It would be Mississippi State beats Ole Miss. Wow. But anyway, this is David Hale trending up, suffering for the Seminoles. He says it was Frederick Nietzsche who posted that all life is suffering. I always say in the investment markets, it's a market of regret. So I agree with that quote. And though he came up with that idea of full 81 years before Mike Norvell was born, it's safe to say that Florida State's past 2 years are pretty much what he had in mind. To recap, FSU's Heisman candidate QB got hurt in a meaningless game against an FCS foe in November 2023. As a result, the Noles were snubbed from the college football playoff despite a 13-0 record. Norvell was a top contender for the vacant Alabama job, but instead he returned to FSU with a huge new contract. The Noles limped into the next season. Astonishingly, went 2-10, overhauled the coaching staff, beat Alabama to open this season, lost 4 in a row, including one to Stanford, rebounded, and then on Friday offered perhaps the single greatest example of the incredibly thin line between comedy and tragedy as the world has ever seen in the final 4 minutes of a 21-11 loss to NC State. For the year, by the way, and I referenced this in yesterday's podcast, only teams outgained their opponents by 40 yards or more in all but one game this year. Number 2, Indiana. Number 5, Texas Tech. Number 6, Ole Miss. Number 7, Oregon State. And then those are all top 10 teams, one loss or less. And obviously Florida State is in that group, but they're 5-6. So that tells you the bad luck. And then David Hale continues here. The Noles D stuffed the Wolfpack on 4th down. So this was in their Friday game against NC State with 3:53 to play. NC State punted. The punt bounced off a Florida State player's helmet, rebounded backward, and landed in the arms of the NC State punter near the original line of scrimmage. Think about that. I mean, I've never seen that happen. The Noles D held again, forced another punt, and this time FSU's Squirrel White fumbled the catch, giving the ball to NC State again. The Noles D held yet again. Think of this bad luck. So all life is suffering. The market is a market of regret. But NC State, so the Noles D held yet again. NC State opted to go for it on 4th and 6 and found the end zone from 12 yards out. FSU still had a chance, but shanked a short field goal at second in the game, and by the end, all that was missing was the PA system at Carter Finley Stadium playing Yakety Sax on repeat, and Norvell being knocked unconscious after trying to exit the field through a tunnel a roadrunner had painted on a brick wall. I love David Hale's writing. Of course, Nietzsche also argued in his 4 Great Errors that all free will was an illusion, so it's fair to say that it isn't Norvell's fault, but rather the inevitable result of a chaotic universe. On the other hand, another of his 4 errors was don't sign DJ Ugalali or Tommy Castellanos in back-to-back seasons, so perhaps there's ample blame to go around. I love David Hale. Happy Monday, November 24th. I hope everybody has a great day. Attitude is everything, as I like to say. I'm going to read that quote that I like. Attitude is more important, than house, home, church. If you have the right attitude, it goes a long way. I tell my kids that all the time. You can't control a lot of things in life, but you can control your attitude. So everybody have a great attitude. Have a good Monday. Happy holiday week. Happy Thanksgiving week. Take care. Thankful, grateful, blessed.